I feel very honored to be here and to be able to share my story, especially the first story, and hopefully inspire you all with tales from my life. The name of my story is Cello, My Voice, and there's 4 chapters in the story. So the first story that I have was about finding the cello and how did I even become a cellist to begin with. I guess it all started with my grandfather, who was a saxophone player, and I always saw him playing and I was inspired by him because though saxophone wasn't his main job, he was always playing whenever I'd go over to his house, and it was his passion, it was his love. And no one else in my family played music, and so that was all I really had to base it off of. So when I was young, I kind of struggled with a lot of different things like OCD and depression and anxiety and all these things that for a really young kid were difficult because I didn't understand them, and I was unsure of myself, and I had nothing. I knew I was smart, but that's all I knew, and I didn't have anything else besides that, and nothing to ground me, really. So when I was 9 years old, this was the end of 3rd grade, we got ushered into the cafeteria of the school, and there were all the music teachers, and they had all the instruments there. And you were allowed to try 3 instruments, and they would immediately give you a grade on the instrument, which I thought was crazy because it's like, we literally just touched the instrument. Why are you grading us? But that's the way they did it. So you could try 3 instruments. So I first went to the drums, and I tried to play a little drums, and my rhythm has never been that good. It's been okay at best. So that's what he gave me. He gave me a fair. I said, okay, fine. Then I went over to the guy who had the violins, and I didn't even know what the cello was called at that time. I went over to him, and I knew I didn't want to play the violin because the violin was just too high, and like everybody played it, and I didn't want to be like everybody else. So I said, all right, give me that other thing, whatever that was. It was the cello. So I played it, I squeaked out a few notes, and he gave me a good. So, okay, all right, fine. And then at the end, what I really wanted to play was the saxophone because I wanted to be like my grandfather. So I remember waiting in line for the saxophone, and the kid before me, his name was Casey, I still remember that, he played one note, and it was like the most beautiful note I'd heard. It was so just perfect, and the teacher wrote down, "Oh wow, you're playing," and he gave him a good grade. And then I stepped up to it, and I blew into it, and it was like a moose being tortured or something. It was horrible. It was the worst sound. And the teacher was like, "Oh," he like grimaced, and he wrote down "not recommended." And I just remember being so crushed at that moment, so sad, because I was like, I'm never going to be like my grandfather. I'm already 9 years old, and I'm a failure. Like, I'm not going to be like him. This teacher just told me I shouldn't do this. So I sat back down, and then later in the day, I went home and I told my mom that I had tried musical instruments. And this is just the way my mom thinks. She's hilarious. Like, she told me, she said, "Oh, that's great that you're going to play a musical instrument because it's going to prevent you from getting Alzheimer's when you're older." And Alzheimer's is like when you're really old and you start losing your memory. And I just remember thinking at 9 years old, like, what kind of motivation is that for a 9-year-old kid? Like, why would that motivate me? But that was her thinking. So I decided that, you know what, fine, this guy gave me a good, let me give it a shot. So my mom knew that I was like a very anxious kid, so she decided to get me lessons before I even started school, because you could start lessons at school. You didn't have to take private lessons, but she decided to give me private lessons with the teacher. And immediately he told me, he was like, look, this is a really good match. Like, you need to go to a real cello teacher, because he was a violinist mostly. And so he did, and from there I started my journey on the cello, and I quickly realized that playing the cello was a way for me to kind of say what I needed to say, because I had so many emotions that I couldn't say. I was afraid to say them because I was very anxious, and I didn't want to look like a loser to, you know, other kids. But when I could play the cello, I realized I could put my emotion into it, and I didn't have to say anything. I could just play the instrument, and it was like my voice, and it was like I could finally speak without having to speak. And for better or for worse, that's kind of the way the cello has always been in my life. It's been my ability to communicate with the world and express my emotions and my feelings without having to say them in words, because even to this day, I'm still not that good at expressing my emotions in words. So years later, this is skipping many things, but years later, I still play music with that same music teacher. His name is Larry Marino. He was the first guy to put a cello in my hands, and we still talk to this day. And I asked him, I said, Larry, why did you give me a good that first day? Like, why'd you give me a good rating? And he said to me, he said, oh, well, I give everybody a good because I just wanted kids to come into the program. And I was just like, oh man, you gotta be kidding. My whole life is like it's just a sham. It's based off a sham. But that being said, I'm very happy that he did that, because it started off my journey that I'll have for the rest of my life. The next chapter in my life is called Publishing the Passion. So I grew up playing the cello, and I took private lessons, and I decided that I first went to a college that wasn't for music. Well, I was thinking maybe I'll do math and music, and then I took Calculus 3, and I was like, maybe I'll just do music. So I went to a different college for studying just music, and I went to this place because I knew that I could explore really my passion rather than being confined to a box, because I really always wanted to use cello as my personal expression. And I found that a lot of the time, the way that classical music was taught and the environment it existed in was very closed off and closed-minded. And it wasn't about being creative. It was about following what other people had done in the past. And I didn't like that so much. I liked the music, and I liked expressing myself, but I didn't like feeling boxed in, like I had to do it your way or this way. So I decided to go to a music school that was very kind of crazy. It was called California Institute of the Arts. It was out in California, and I was scared of going to California my whole life because they have earthquakes, but somehow I managed to survive there. And I did my undergraduate degree, and I was able to compose and perform my own music and play with a group like kind of in a jazz setting or things that I had written. And I didn't have to necessarily play in the orchestra. I got to do things that I wanted to do. And my final recital was like half stand-up comedy. I was telling funny stories and then half music I had written and things like that, which you couldn't do in a regular school. Most conservatories don't let you do that. So that being said, when I was studying there, during the summer, one of the summers, I went to this place called New Directions Cello Festival, which is a festival that has all different types of cello playing that's not classical. And my dad actually found this because he knew that I wasn't, I wasn't keen on becoming a classical cellist. So there I met different people that did all these interesting things, whether it was jazz or rock or electronic or everything with the cello. And I met this one guy who I'm still friends with to this day, and his name's Barry Kornhauser. And he came from a background of playing guitar and bass and jazz on the cello, but he had never really had formal cello training. So he had this just amazing mind. He started showing me all these different ways you could play chords on the cello, which is like playing multiple notes at the same time, which is not groundbreaking on the cello because that's something that's been done for hundreds of years. But the way that which he was doing it was very interesting because you could use it in a different setting other than classical music. You could use it in jazz or in rock or accompanying a singer. Something that they don't usually teach you how to do when you're learning how to play the cello. So I saw him play, and he was showing me, oh, you can play a C chord like this, or you can play a C chord like this, or like this, or like this. And I was like, wow, that's pretty impressive. I've never even thought to do it like that. So naturally, I'm lazy. So I went home, and I was like, well, someone must have made a book already or a chart or something that has all the different ways to play a C chord, right? And I went online, and at this time it was like 2009, and I was maybe like 19 or something like that. And no one had done it. And I thought, that's weird. Like, it seems like kind of a simple concept. Like, why has no one done this? So at that time, I was lifeguarding, if you can believe it. And I was not the greatest lifeguard because I kind of didn't pay enough attention. Everybody was fine. Nobody got hurt. But I had a lot of free time. So I decided to start thinking, hey, how are all the different ways that I could write out this one chord, this C chord? And I started to do it, and I sat there and I wrote through all the possible variations of it. And I said, maybe this could be a book, like no one else has done this before. And it wasn't necessarily that hard. It was just kind of like, it took a lot of effort because I had to think about every single combination that you could possibly do on the instrument. So I just kind of did it more and more and more and more until I finally had like all the possibilities that I could think of. And by the time that I had finished college, it was something that I really wanted to publish. So I talked to my teachers, and they said, I told them about this project, and they were like, nah, this is a great idea. You should publish this. And I talked to them about, should I get a publisher? And I talked to them at that time. By this time, music stores were mostly on the way out. I mean, how many physical music stores were left? Not that many. So I talked to them, and I said, should I go to a publisher and get this? And they said, the amount of money you're going to make from having a publisher publish it is like so little. And it's like, what are they really going to do? So I decided, okay, fine. Maybe I'll just publish this book myself because I'm going to be selling it online anyway on my website. So when I finished school, I was kind of confused as to what to do because now I went back home. I went back to New Jersey, which is near New York City, and I had a lot of free time. And I was like, I got to finish this book. I got to do something to show myself that I can do something, I can accomplish something. Because when you come out of music school, it's not like a clear path, like, oh, you automatically have a ton of jobs. You have to figure out how to make some sort of living. So I decided to really go all into it, and I published the book. I had my cousin do the cover, and it came out really well. And I remember holding that first physical copy of the book and like looking at it and like feeling very proud of myself, like, wow, I really did it. I actually made this book. And it was never easy for me to appreciate the work that I had done, or like feel good about the things I did. I was always very hard on myself. I was always like my worst critic, and still am for some things. But holding that copy of the first book really made me feel like I could accomplish something. And then I gradually began to market the book myself, because no one else was helping me. So I went to all different Facebook groups and forums on the internet, and I gradually started to sell the book all across the world. Like, people were interested in it, they found it, and they were really like, oh, this is a great resource. And I still get it to this day, like, oh, thanks for doing this. Like, I've always wanted something like this book. And it makes me happy to know that something that I've done is across the world. And, you know, it's a small group of people that use the book, right? But to those people, it makes a difference. And I'm happy I was able to do that. The next chapter in my book is called Underground Artist. So when I graduated from college, it was kind of tough, to be honest. I was in a bit of a dark place because there's no real structure when you're a musician. You have to figure everything out for yourself, and it's not easy. It's really not easy. So I ended up trying to find any sort of opportunities to play music, and I was on Craigslist, which is like a list where people look for jobs and things like that, and I found this ad for a band. They played in the subways of New York City, and I lived close to New York City. I lived in New Jersey, so I had to go across the bridge and then into the city. So very close, but not right there. So I found this band, and it was made up of an 8-string electric bass, drums, and then cello. And they also wore masks in the subway, all different types of masks. So it was a type of music called post-rock, which I'd never even heard of before. But I kind of liked it because it was all instrumental, so there was no vocals. And it was very heavily compositionally based. So it was something that I could kind of succeed in because I was good at composing, and I had a kind of my own vision. So not only could I play the music, but I could write new music too, which is something I was really interested in. So at the beginning, you know, I remember playing one of our first shows, and it was in Brooklyn at this really terrible bar in the basement, and it's just like, I was looking around and just thinking, like, what is this? Like, and the music before me, it's like this crazy aggressive metal, like, and I hated it. It was so loud. I hated it. But I played the music, and I did enjoy playing it. And, you know, I wasn't making barely any money at the time. I was making no money, essentially. I was staying at my parents' place. But I had this passion, and I was trying to create. So quickly, I got into the band, and in addition to playing actual shows, they weren't amazing shows, but they were shows, we would play twice a week in the subways of New York City, which was a real eye-opener for me, because I'd never anticipated doing anything like that when I played the cello. I mean, you grow up playing the cello, and you're playing in an orchestra or a string quartet. It's all very, like, high class, you know. You don't expect to see yourself playing in the subway of New York City, right? So I did that, but at the beginning, for a long time, it was kind of cool for me, because what I noticed was that when I played there, though again, I mean, we would sell our CDs, and we would sell, you know, we'd ask for tips and stuff like that. So most of the money went straight back into the paying for the band and tolls and just trying to grow the band itself. So again, I wasn't making any money, but I did have a passion. And what really motivated me was when I was playing the music, one, it was original music, and it was something that I was creating and I was a part of. And when I was in the subways, the thing with New York is it's so diverse. There's people from all across the world. Literally, every language you could imagine is spoken there. And I would play, and I would see all these crowds start to gather of people from across the globe that, bankers and people that were, service workers and people from Africa and people from Sweden. Like all these people were coming together and they were listening to the music. And they would stop and they would listen and they was like, oh, wow, that was really cool. This is like something different. Because I guess I always wanted to be different. I always wanted to have something that I could say was uniquely my own, rather than fitting in some sort of box, like playing in an orchestra or doing classical music the way everybody else had done it. So I would play in the subways, and I would see all these people gather, and it made me feel good. It wasn't easy because I had to carry my cello and then this huge thing of gear with an amp and my seat and my music and everything. And I'd have to go up the stairs, and it's like insane. I'd have to drive into the city. And I did that for years with the band, and it taught me a lot about, perseverance and just doing something over and over, and trying to do something that you do love. And I had a lot of good experiences there, and some not good experiences, because like I mentioned, when you're playing in the subway, that's not something you're ever prepared for when you start playing the cello, right? Because in New York, there's a lot of people that are kind of crazy, and also there's a lot of homeless people and people that might be on drugs or something like that. And you have to be paying attention, because if you're not paying attention, you're liable to have somebody come up to you and either steal your money or potentially attack you, which is something that you never thought was going to happen when you played the cello, right? So I used to play with my eyes closed because that's just how I connect with the music. You can't really do that when you're playing in the subway, because you always kind of have to be on guard and you have to make sure that you're safe, right? So I always thought like, okay, my last line of defense, just in case I have to defend myself, is the end pin from this cello, which is like the little like stick at the bottom. This is like my weapon just in case. So it taught me about being perseverant and doing something that was not easy, and having a passion and playing and connecting with people that I normally would never have connected with. So over the years, though, I got older, and it was difficult to do that all the time. And it's very difficult being in a band too, because when you're in a band, there's different personalities, and it's hard to agree on certain things. But beyond the subway, we also played other shows, and we did tours around the United States, but they weren't big tours like Taylor Swift. They were tours where you'd be in a van and you're driving from one place to the next, and you're not playing the greatest shows, and you're not eating the greatest food, and you're sleeping in a motel or whatever, or the van. So it really taught me about, again, being perseverant and believing in something. But it's not easy to maintain that. And eventually, with that band, I decided that I kind of expressed my creativity. We'd done a number of albums together, and I had made some songs and contributed to the band and made some music that I was really proud of. But eventually, I realized that the chapter in my life was kind of over, and I needed to move on and do something different. And that brings me to our next chapter. So the next chapter in my life is called Beyond Borders. So by this time, I had met my wife, Ming. We weren't married yet. We got married in 2016. So we had met in America, and she was from Vietnam, and I honestly didn't know barely anything about Vietnam. I mean, one time I asked her if there was ice cream in Vietnam, and she almost punched me in the face because she was like, "You don't know if there's ice cream in Vietnam?" So I didn't know much about Vietnam because I didn't grow up in a place where there was a lot of Vietnamese people. There's certain pockets in America where there's a lot of Vietnamese community, but where I grew up was not. There was more like Chinese, Japanese, Korean, but no Vietnamese. So all I really knew about Vietnam had come from like war movies and stuff that I'd learned, in school. But beyond that, I didn't know the culture. I didn't know anything really. So when I first came to visit my wife here, she took me to, she's from Hanoi, so she took me to the Water Puppets show, which is, a big cultural thing. And I did fall asleep. I'm not going to lie. I did fall asleep during the show, but that's because it was very peaceful. And I've fallen asleep many times before at shows, so that's not the reason. But while I was there, I got to really experience the traditional music because they have a traditional music band playing. And I really loved the danbo. I didn't know what it was called, but I loved the sound of it because it was had this very mournful sound that reminded me of the cello, and it resonated with me. So that was kind of the first exposure to Vietnamese music and culture. And a couple years later, after we'd had our first daughter, my wife had a project here. She was a Fulbright scholar, and she had a grant with the U.S. Embassy to she's a dance movement therapist. So she went and trained teachers about how to help students, children with special needs. And I also was a part of that. So we moved back to Vietnam. And when I was here, I'm not naturally the most outgoing person, which is not great if you're a musician, honestly. But she helped me along, and she helped introduce me to people. And the more people that I got to know, I was able to start collaborating with Vietnamese artists. And one of the first things I did was play with Fusa Lab, which was a collective in Hanoi of musicians that took traditional instruments from Vietnam and also the ethnic minorities in Vietnam. And they created something new with it. They weren't playing the traditional music, but they were composing. They were taking elements and making new music, new instruments too. So I was part of a workshop that was run by the British Council, where I got to collaborate with all these musicians, where we were taking the instruments that they had, and some were from the Ede people in Vietnam, and these gongs, and some were Tang Nguyen, and some were these bamboo instruments that Nguyen Duc Minh had created, and I was really inspired by that. So I was able to create a project with them, and it really resonated with me because it came back to the feeling of creating something new with these old materials almost. That's always what I wanted to do with the cello. I always wanted to make something my own, make something different, while having this medium which was, hundreds of years old, right? The cello has been around since, the 1600s. But taking that and making it your own. So gradually I started to meet more and more musicians, and I collaborated with them, and I've collaborated with Ming, like I mentioned, and he has a group called DANDA, which takes a lot of these instruments and creates a new thing. So I've become a special guest on their show, where we've written music together. Me and Ming would just sit down and we'd improvise together, and we had this hours longs of different things, and I'd go back and I'd listen to the music, and some of it had some really cool ideas, and other parts were all right, well, get rid of that. And we tried to create pieces from that. And I worked with him, then I worked with his band, and I was able to be a special guest on his show, where we debuted these pieces of music that used these bamboo instruments and used the cello and fused them together, and even used part of my culture because I'm Jewish, and at that time the war between Israel and Gaza had just started, and there was a lot of hatred on both sides, and I was kind of had these feelings, and I used there was this thing. It was a buffalo horn from the Ede people that he had. It's called the kippah, and he used it in some of his compositions. And it's funny for me because that name kippah is the same name as like the Jewish hat that the Jews wear. So it was like this kind of weird connection. So we decided to create a piece that had this feeling of this two cultures coming together, where I used some of elements of Jewish music, and he used elements of obviously these traditional musics from Vietnam. So that was kind of bridging the gap. And the more that I've done this in my career, the more that I've realized that I'm no expert on Vietnamese music by any stretch of the imagination. But what I am good at is creating and collaborating and improvising. So when I sit down with different musicians, even if I don't necessarily speak Vietnamese wonderfully, I'm able to talk through my instrument. Even if I don't know necessarily the songs outright, right? Sometimes you don't have to know the song perfectly to be able to contribute to it. So what I try to do is listen, be respectful of the culture, but at the same time try to add in my own voice to it. And as I've done that, I've been able to collaborate with different traditional artists playing, Dan Chang and Dan Bo, and I've started to write for these instruments too. So I have a lot of pieces that I've written for cello and traditional instruments where it's a dialogue, where you have these two instruments that have never met each other, right, from other sides of the globe, but in the end they're very similar. They still speak the same language, because a lot of people ask me, like, how do you combine Vietnamese music with Western music? And it's never been that difficult for me, because it's all kind of just sound. It all comes from the same place, right? It's all emotion put in through this medium of music. So I don't necessarily think it's hard to create something new, even though that these instruments, you'd say, like, they've never even seen each other before, right? It's the feeling. So one thing that I've been working on, I still haven't finished yet, is an album called CHUYN, where it's about this feeling of two different worlds kind of colliding and collaborating and becoming friends with one another. So taking my vision as a cellist and combining it with different artists from Vietnam, and taking, composing new music for this new set of instruments. And for me, I find that to be very rewarding, because at the end of the day, it's something that, it's my voice. It's something that is uniquely me, and I can express myself through not only the instrument, but now through different cultures as well. And I'm really happy that I can share that with the world. I would say that anybody who's looking for what's their purpose, what is their meaning, why are we here, what are we doing, why, what is this all about? Finding something that you are truly passionate about is freeing in some ways, and in other ways it's not, because not necessarily always having that passion is not necessarily always conducive to making a lot of money in this world. But having that passion feeds you. It feeds your soul, because you have something to which, when you're doing it, you lose yourself, right? When I'm playing music, and I have a lot of thoughts and many other things, you know, during the day. But when I'm playing music and I'm collaborating with other people, or when I'm composing, or I'm in the studio and I'm doing that, everything feels right. It feels okay. It feels like this is what I'm supposed to be doing, you know? So I have that connection with whatever's out there. I don't know if I'm very spiritual, but whatever it is, you feel connected to it because you can lose yourself and be in the zone and do something that you really believe in. So anybody that's really looking for something that is their passion, I think my story can show you that it's not an easy road. I wouldn't say this is an easy road, but it can help you fulfill kind of your own destiny and who you are as a person.